Hey everyone, and welcome to the third week of Science of the Bible. So far we've been looking at what is human life, when does it begin, when does it begin scientifically, when does it begin biblically, and we've kind of been looking at the characteristics of life. So we've gone through cellular organization, which was the first episode. We went through growth and development and energy use, which is the second episode. And then this one, today we are going to start looking at reproduction and heredity. So reproduction and heredity are two characteristics that also start before birth occurs. So before our babies are born, reproduction and heredity are present. So these two characteristics of life are going to be mainly present. They're going to show themselves later in life, but they become present before birth. So we're going to jump in and we are going to start looking at reproduction from a scientific view. So reproduction is somewhat of an iffy topic as being present before birth or not. The reason I say this is because for girls, reproduction, the reproductive needs, so women's eggs, are present before birth. For boys, that is a different story. So we'll look at each of those individually. So women or girls are born with all the eggs that they will ever have. So what this means is once a girl is born, all the eggs that she could ever use to produce offspring are present. So they have to be there before birth happens. Now, while those eggs aren't released until later on, until puberty, they are formed by 20 weeks. So at 20 weeks of age, of 20 weeks of fetal age, so in our mother's wombs, if we are having little girls, they have 6 to 7 million eggs at that point. So for example, my two daughters that are inside of my wife right now being formed and growing and developing, this week they are 20 weeks old of fetal age. They have 6 to 7 million eggs apiece. That's what they should have, is 6 to 7 million eggs. So at 20 weeks old, we already have the reproduction needs for women. Now, there has been some legislation introduced in certain places of the US, one being Colorado, where I am from, where abortion at 22 weeks is fine for any circumstance. So no matter what, if you just want to have an abortion at 22 weeks, that is okay. Now we know that at 20 weeks, cellular organization is present. We know growth and development is occurring. We know acquisition and use of energy is happening. And now we know the reproductive system, so the eggs that would turn into new people, if they're fertilized, are already formed inside of our little girls. So that's 4 out of the main 7 characteristics of life that are already present at 20 weeks. But in a lot of places, that is still okay to have an abortion, which means you are taking a life. So as we've gone through all this, it's just another scientific proof that our children are living inside of their mother's womb. So reproduction is another scientific proof. Now, where this gets a little iffy is on the boys' side, on the men's side. So, men are not born with sperm ready to go. So, girls have eggs, men have sperm. That's what comes together to form a baby. We're talking about science, so we can just talk about these things. But that's what makes it iffy, that men do not have that ready to go. Not until puberty do men get sperm. So, sperm doesn't form until puberty hits for boys. Now, the reason I say that's iffy is because people will use that to say, well, the development of reproduction does not occur until puberty because that's when eggs are released and that's when sperm is present. However, reproductive organs, the organs that are going to be making sperm, are present way before babies are born, in men as well as women. And what we need to look at is human development. So we are looking at human development and not individually boys versus girls. So in human development, we must say that when girls' eggs form is when this step occurs, because women are humans. So the earliest step that we see reproduction very, very present is before birth in females. And that means that reproduction is present before birth occurs, which means that abortion of any sort before a baby is born, so killing a baby in a mother's womb, is considered killing and not just a medical necessity. It is never a medical necessity to take a life out of another life. To take away a life is not a medical necessity when we're talking about fetuses. And now we can go down the rabbit hole of what if the mom's going to die? What if this? What if XYZ? No matter what, it is still killing a living thing. It is still taking a living thing and making it non-living, which is not okay, which is against the commandments, against God's commandments. Thou shalt not kill. So we should not kill in the womb either. So that's the scientific side. We're looking at the characteristics of life scientifically. We're saying that, yes, we are 100% in fact living, and this is another characteristic of life that backs that. So now let's look from the reproduction side, because remember, God gives us, or from the biblical side, remember, God gives us keys in the Bible that match up really well with the characteristics of life that science even says. So Genesis 1:22, God blessed them, saying, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters and the seas, and let birds multiply on the earth. So God's telling people, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth with those of your kind. Now, we're talking about physical reproduction here still. Genesis 9:7, as for you, be fruitful and multiply, populate the earth abundantly and multiply in it. So when we're talking to Noah, again, they had to fill the earth, they had to reproduce. So reproduction is very important for life. Without reproduction, the next generation can't happen and humankind would cease to exist. So without reproduction, without that characteristic, we cannot live anymore. We cannot continue to be humans because our species would die out. Now, there are some species of animals like ligers, donkeys, those things that cannot actually reproduce anymore, but they're still classified as living. But a liger can't have babies with another liger. So a lion and a tiger, they are not fertile. So they actually say that they're not a species because don't fit the classifications of life, but they are living things. So it's really cool when you look at that. So Genesis 1:28, I'm given a lot of verses for the physical reproduction, multiplication, showing how this is biblical that matches with our science. So Genesis 1:28, God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it. Again, fill the earth, subdue the earth, work it, multiply. We're talking about physical reproduction again, lining up with our scientific reproduction is a characteristic of life. You have to have reproduction for a species to live. Well, God knew this. God gave us the ability to reproduce, to fill the earth. So reproduction in the first chapter of the Bible is touched on. At the very first chapter of the Bible, we start talking about reproduction. Now remember, we always look at this, how our physical matches up with our spiritual. So if we jump into the New Testament, we can look at Matthew 28:19-20, the Great Commission. So when we think about reproduction, we think mostly about having our babies, having our children, but reproduction also happens spiritually when we make new disciples or we have new believers in Christ. So the Great Commission is, therefore go and make disciples of all nations. Baptize them in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. And surely I am with you always to the very end of the age. So therefore go and make disciples of all nations. So we're making new believers. We're making new disciples. So we are multiplying believers. We are multiplying our faith and getting new believers. So we are reproducing. When we reproduce, we make a new human. When we reproduce physically, we make a new believer. So this lines up with our spiritual, the Great Commission of making new believers. Well, to have new believers, you have to have other people. So reproduction is another characteristic that fits with spiritual life as well. We must reproduce and bring more people to Jesus Christ to believe in our Father, in the Son, and to believe in the Holy Spirit and become Spirit-filled. So we must reproduce our faith on a spiritual level. And then Romans 10:14-15, how then can they call on the one they have not believed in? And how can they believe in the one whom they have not heard? And how can they hear without someone preaching to them? And how can anyone preach unless they are sent? As it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who bring good news. We must bring the good news to people in order for them to become disciples and become believers. So we must bring forth the reproduction from us and give it to others. So we must give life to other people's belief in the Father and belief in Jesus Christ, belief in the death, burial, resurrection. We must bring forth that for the resurrection, just for the reproduction, just like we must bring forth an egg from a mother and sperm from a father to combine to bring forth new life. So it's really cool because, again, spiritual life matches up with our physical life, and science feeds from both of those to say what living things are, yet we fight against that to say that living things, that babies aren't living, because I don't even know why scientifically they fight that babies aren't living until they're born. There's no scientific evidence at all to support abortion. There is absolutely no science that says abortion is a good thing and that it is not murdering a baby. All the science actually points to abortion as murder. And we still have one characteristic. So our second characteristic today, we're going to briefly touch on it because we're going to touch on it a lot more when we do next week too, is heredity, which is DNA. So at the moment of conception, so we're looking again, as soon as the egg and sperm meet, this characteristic is present. So at the moment of conception, both halves of DNA, so you get half from a mother, half from the father. So what you are carrying inside of yourself, so my DNA, half of my DNA is in my sperm. Half of Becca's DNA is in her egg. So it's not a full pair, it's half of it. And at the moment of conception, those mix together to create a new life. New DNA life too. So at the moment of conception, this DNA comes together, and this is all the genetic information that is needed for life. So at the moment of conception, all the information that will ever be needed for our babies' lives, for the rest of their lives, is present. All the DNA, all the genetic information is present at that moment. As soon as the sperm and the egg meet and combine to create that zygote, all the genetic information is there. And so heredity, our next, so this is our fifth characteristic of life, and it is our third characteristic of life that is present at the moment of conception. Third characteristic of life at the moment of conception, that's almost half the characteristics, all present immediately. So how can you deny that our babies are not alive immediately? Because half the characteristics of life are present immediately at conception. Now let's look even more. Because it seems completely nuts that all of our genetic information that we will ever need in our lives forever and ever and ever until we die is there immediately. But let's put it in perspective. According to geneticsTheTech.org, so this is a company that does like genetics and everything, each cell in our body has 6 billion base pairs of DNA. So that's 6 billion pairs of DNA in one cell. At the time of conception, you are now one cell, so you have 6 billion base pairs of DNA. As the cells replicate, those pairs of DNA get put into the next cell, and the next cell, and the next cell, and that DNA just keeps going into the new cells. That DNA doesn't change. It doesn't get taken away from or added to. The DNA that's at the beginning, when one cell turns into two, those 6 billion base pairs copy into that second cell. When those two turn to 4, that 6 billion base pair that was in each of these copy into each of these. When 4 goes to 8, those 6 billion base pairs are now in all 8 cells. So instead of 6 billion pairs of DNA, you have around like 50 billion pairs of DNA now. So you're getting a whole bunch of DNA. The exception to this is sex cells. So eggs and sperm or germ cells have 3 billion because they only carry half the genetic information of the mother and half of the father. So that is where we get the difference is in sex cells. So it is really, really cool that at the moment of conception, 6 billion pairs of DNA are present. The DNA that's going to shape lives is there immediately. It is there. So if you, in the life of a fetus, in the life of an infant, in the life of whatever you want to call it, an embryo even, you're getting rid of that DNA that was already present. Scientifically, that DNA is there. So at that moment, you are killing that DNA, forbidding it from ever existing. That DNA that is there no longer can exist. Now, what is really cool is all humans have 99% of DNA that's the same. It's that 1% that makes us different. Now, you might say, well, that's not even close. I don't look anywhere close to someone from Africa or Asia or someone from another country. I don't look anything like them. But let's put this in perspective. 99% is the same, 1% is different. We are talking about 6 billion pairs of DNA. So we are looking a little bit around 500 million pairs of DNA are different. Sorry. We're looking around like millions of pairs of DNA, not 500 million. I did my math wrong. But we are looking at millions of pairs of DNA that are different, which gives a huge change. Because if your DNA for skin tone is different, you're going to look different. If your DNA for eye color is different, you're going to look different. For hair color, for hair loss, if that's different, you're going to look different. So even though it's 1%, that 1% is what we see in those changes. And that 1% is what we're going to kind of talk about next week, because we're going to talk about adaptation, change, and everything, and how that happens in humans from that 1% of DNA that is different from person to person. So next week we're going to look at that. And something really cool that we need to remember is that this DNA is what is replicated. So heredity, we've talked about DNA, but the thing about heredity is the ability to pass on DNA from one living thing to another. So heredity is our ability to pass on our DNA to our children. So I passed on half of my DNA to my babies, Emmy and Hazel. Becca passed on half of her DNA, so they will be half of each of us combined together. If they eventually get married and have kids with their husbands, they will have half of their DNA and half of their husbands. So it'll be a fourth of mine, a fourth of Becca's going in, and the melting pot continues, and it keeps going and it keeps going, and it gives for change. That's how we can change throughout time. I'm not talking about evolution throughout time. I'm talking about changing, not evolving. So evolving is different than changes and adaptation. So we'll talk about that next week, because that's our last characteristic of life we'll talk about. But before we finish, we need to look at heredity from a biblical standpoint. So Genesis 2:24, therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. So you need to cleave from your mother and father when you when you get married. You need to go and live with your wife. That needs to be your main relationship. And then you become one flesh, which obviously means that you consummate your marriage, you become one together. But you literally do become one flesh when you have children. Your flesh and your spouse's flesh combine together and become one. So in your children, you see your one flesh coming together. And now this backs the science that we talked about. Remember, we said, how is the Bible going to back this? Well, we become one flesh. Half of me, half of Becca, Emmy, Hazel. So that's me, my wife, and my two twins that are in my wife's womb right now. Half of me, half of Becca, one flesh, and the two babies that are in her womb. It comes together and becomes one. Now, of course, that's another way of interpreting this. But God gives us hints in here to show us how this is true and how it supports the science that he then reveals to us. He gives us the hints to find this the right way. And then another way where we look at heredity. So another thing that is very important with heredity is lineages are super important in the Bible. You read about so many lineages in the Bible about so-and-so was the son of so-and-so, was the son of so-and-so, was the son of so-and-so, and all the generations. Well, that is to show the heredity and the passing down of traits from one father to the son, from that son to his son, from that son to his son. So that shows the lineages, which is heredity. Heredity is the passing of traits to your offsprings through a line. So the lineages in the Bible show how that was tracked and how it was important for lineages to be tracked, which leads to heredity. So those two, reproduction, heredity, two other characteristics of life that are present before birth even happens. Now, we have talked about 5 characteristics of life so far. Every single characteristic is present before birth occurs, which means that life begins before birth happens. Life is there before a baby is born, because 5 out of the 7, so we are now above 50%. We are above 50% of the characteristics of life are present before birth, which means life must begin before birth. And for someone to argue what point that is in is ridiculous. As soon as life begins, it begins. As soon as conception, life happens. There should not be a time that says, at this age in a pregnancy, abortion is no longer good and it is now murder. No. Abortion is murder at any stage in a pregnancy, because you are ending a life. You are taking a living thing and seizing it to live. So we're looking at this scientifically. Next week will be our last week looking at this, and then we'll go on to a new topic, which I'll introduce briefly at the end of next week. But next week we will be talking more about DNA, adaptation, and change. I look really forward to putting that up again. If there's any questions you have, please feel free to leave those in the comments. If you do have questions or comments or want me to clarify anything, feel free to put those in the comments, and I'll look and I can address those at the beginning of my next video. I am totally okay with addressing any questions that arise. That is part of science, is having questions and asking questions. So put questions in the comments. Subscribe to Becca's YouTube if you haven't before, and I look forward to seeing you all next week. Bye.